Thank you for joining us for another edition of Against the Current, coming to you live from the Skyline Club atop the Old Republic Building in downtown Chicago. Pleased this week to have Chicago radio and broadcasting legend Bruce Dumont, the visionary who gave the world a Museum of Broadcast Communication. Join us this week, Bruce. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, nice to be here.
And also, too, I should say, gave the world me. And not that you begat me.
I'll take credit for it.
Yeah, credit blame. Also, a fellow Sox season ticket holder.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's
we all know each other on a first name basis.
That's exactly. It's a nice place to relax and for a quiet, for solitude.
And nobody bothers you.
Yeah, that's right. At least not since 2005. But I want to start with the Museum of Broadcast Communications. Some people probably still getting familiar with it. It's one of the new additions to the rich culture that is downtown Chicago, particularly with different museums. So just give us a little bit of background on the thinking behind the museum, what prompted you to do it, and what that process was like, and the contribution you think it's making to the city and to broadcast communications more generally.
Well, the idea came back it was really the late 70s. I was producing the Lee Phillips Show for Channel 2 WBBM television. And in the course of putting together the video packages that sort of led in and out of the commercial breaks, I would go back to the tape library and I would see, it was all 2-inch tape at that point, and I would see it all piled up. And there was historic tape. There was the Kennedy-Nixon debate, there was the arrival of Queen in 1959, all kinds of Chicago-related things. And it bothered me that no one was keeping track of it. Literally, there was piled high, falling over, no index cards, nothing. So it bothered me, and in the afternoon I had a buddy that worked in the master control, so if there was anything I wanted to look at, after I booked the show for the next day, I could go back there and watch whatever I wanted. But it bothered me that all this stuff wasn't being taken care of. Nobody cared about it at all. So probably a couple of years later, I was on the board of the Chicago Television Academy. This is like 1982. And they were looking for a way to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the Chicago Television Academy. So I raised my hand and I said, I think there should be a broadcast museum in Chicago where people could donate tapes, because I figured if they were handling the tapes so poorly at Channel 2, the other owned and operated stations were probably handling it the same way. And the president of the Academy at that time, a guy by the name of Bob Smith, said, Dumont, pointed to me, Dumont, you're a committee of one, go ahead, work on it. And
So you were the curator at large at that point.
That was when it all began. And so the idea, and again, I wasn't an executive. I was producing a live television show every day, so I didn't have any secretarial staff. But I started to go out and talk to people, and a lot of people that I met in broadcasting who I knew, they sort of patted me on the head. They said, well, this is a good idea, but we should have done this 20 years ago. And I said, you're right. We should have done this 20 years ago. I said, but let's not meet in 20 years and wish we would have done it 40 years ago. So, but again, nobody wrote a check or anything. They just sort of patted me on the back. Well, let me know when you get some money. Of course, they weren't bringing out any money themselves. And then in fortuitous time, in August of this would have been 83, I had a meeting. I asked my friend Dan Miller, who you know,
Sure.
who was the publisher or the editor of Crane Chicago Business at the time, could he set up a lunch with Rance Crane, who was the owner of Crane Communications, and also was the publisher of Advertising Age, because I felt if you're going to do a museum about television and radio, because we had included radio as well, that you really needed to deal with commercials, because obviously advertising was the glue that kept it all together. So he set up this lunch. And I went to lunch at the old Armando's. And again, a nice reception. And Rance Crane gave me a couple of names of people in advertising that I should contact. And I went back to Channel 2. And when I got back at Channel 2, I had received a phone call. I received a phone call from Channel 7 that Dennis Swanson, who was the president of Channel 7, had been reading my monthly reports that I was giving to the Television Academy board about this idea I had for a broadcast museum. And the board, after about 3 months, gave me $250 to cover cab fare and lunch fares. That was about it. But it was very, very ad hoc. And the call was that the week before, Fahey Flynn, who was the top anchorman in Chicago for over 40 years. He was really the father of sort of Happy Talk News at Channel 7, but he was a huge star at Channel 2 before that. He had died. And the same week he died, Frank Reynolds died of ABC Network News, who began his career at Channel 2 in Chicago. And the call was that in their name, at the memorial service the following week, they were going to present me with a check for $5,000 in their name to help my idea of this.
Because they believed in the idea.
Because they believed in the idea. And so I called up my newfound friend, Rance Crane, who I had just had lunch with 90 minutes earlier, and shared the news. He said, "That's terrific, I'll match it." So we went from $0 to $10,000 in one day. And so then I began to call back all the people that had patted me on the head. And I said, well, let's get together and have this meeting. And the meeting was somewhat historic in that it was in the office of Jeffrey Jacobs, an attorney who had just discovered this new talent coming in from Baltimore by the name of Oprah Winfrey. But he was a leading agent at the time and a divorce attorney, but we knew each other for many, many years. And so we had our organizational meeting, and being a White Sox fan, you will appreciate this. On the first day of the 1983 playoff against the Baltimore Orioles, which the White Sox killed the Orioles, we were organizing the Museum of Broadcast Communications, and we were all watching the game out of the side of our eyes.
So while the White Sox were winning ugly, you were winning ugly.
That's right.
Sort of.
That was their big win.
And a compliment. Yes.
That's right.
Right.
That was
yes.
it. So that's big. And then from that point on,
but I mean,
I
it's,
never
so that's
looked back.
mid
I never looked
'80s.
back.
But that took you another 2.5 decades to bring it to what is reality on State and Kinsey downtown.
Yeah, that was the first big step. And then, like any other thing, which was very helpful, is that Arthur Nielsen from the A.C. Nielsen Company had announced in the late '83 that he was going to retire. And so we reached out to him to see if he would be the chairman, because that was obviously a name synonymous with television. He agreed to do it, and in January of 1984, he took over as the chairman. And I became, the president. The first thing I did, by the way, when we had our organizational meeting, the first thing I did was I resigned. I said, listen, I'm not ready for this. I'm not the executive. I can't, I don't have secretarial help. I can't do any of this. So I appointed a committee to find someone who would do it. I was passing off the idea at that first meeting in October of '83. And then a couple of people said, well, what is it that you really need? You need secretarial help. I'll give you secretarial help, but it's your idea. Why don't you keep it moving? And so, in December or in January of '84, they had convinced me that, you stick with it for a couple of years, and, we'll support you. And one of the people that actually made that offer was one of the people that Rance Crane had suggested that I contact, who was the pet of Burson Marsteller in Chicago at the time. And the man that created the famous public service announcement about the Indian with a tear in his eye.
Yeah, sure.
It was, Dick Christian was his name. And he was an early supporter. And then, like any other idea, it grew and more people knew about it. And it just, it eventually, took on a life of its own. And we were able to reach out and, step by step with a lot of pitfalls along the way. The museum just kept going and going, like the Energizer Bunny.
Well, the interesting thing, too, is because you have big marquee ad agencies in the city that did a lot of the commercials you referenced earlier.
Yes.
You've got so much rich television history, not just in news, but, and it's over at the museum.
Sure, right.
The Bozo Show and other iconic shows that were shot in Chicago. And the kind of the politics too. So a lot of the news talk radio stars of yesteryear and not so yesteryear. And so it seems like it's a kind of a good confluence of television and radio broadcasting to have here in Chicago.
Well,
or to locate the museum.
It's also, it's not hometown boosterism to say the pivotal role that Chicago played. When you look at some of the monumental people of the last century who defined radio and television and even motion pictures, you get somebody like Bert Tillstrom who really helped define the early days of television. Edgar Bergen was from Chicago. Charlie McCarthy was created in Rogers Park. Again, an immense star in radio. Then you have Walt Disney, probably the most creative person.
Sure.
Again, grew up, born in Kansas City, but grew up in Chicago.
The Disney charter school,
and on the west side. So you take you talk Walt Disney, you talk about Bert Tillstrom, you talk about Edgar Bergen, three great personalities, and they have two common denominators. They all went to Chicago public schools, and they all created. They gave life and character to imaginary figures, whether it was Charlie McCarthy or, Donald Duck and Kukla and Ali. I mean, they gave life to puppets.
The Chicago public schools have deteriorated since the time Walt Disney.
Just a wee bit.
Attended. What about the state of media? Maybe not so much kind of television and reality TV, but just thinking news programming, whether it's the Happy Talk on your local network affiliate newscast or the quality of talk radio, for example. What's your perspective on how that has changed and morphed and either improved or kind of been denigrated over the last 30 or 40 years?
Well, I think insofar as let me kind of talk about radio first of all. I think that Chicago has always been a good radio town, but early in my career, I had a chance to do two things. I was the original producer of Extension 720 on WGN Radio. That goes back to 1968. And Bob Henley, who was the general manager of the station, said to me, he said, and it was obviously the 60s, there was all kinds of stuff going on. He said, I don't want any listener to WGN Radio ever to say or ever be able to say that they didn't have the information upon which they could make an intelligent decision politically. That was said to me in the day that I was handed the opportunity to be the producer, like 20, whatever I was, mid-20s, to do that show, 50,000 watts, 5 nights a week. So that was one moment, but that was a serious discussion of issues. Now again, Milt Rosenberg eventually took over the program. That show lasted for over 40 years. I mean, that was a long run of serious, erudite, serious discussion. There isn't any other station in the country that did that or tried to do that. Now, what was happening during also...
Is there anybody... I mean, is it too anodyne to say that was a bygone era when people actually understood that part of their job in the media was to impart knowledge to citizens, to make them good citizens in our representative republic? Is that a bygone era, or is that just people kind of waxing nostalgic?
Well, I think it's... Unfortunately, I think it's a bygone era. I think what has replaced that is, there is some of that on public radio. It has a political slant, I believe, that we might agree on. Others might not agree on it, but I think it certainly is a left of center perspective of what's going on. The other thing that was happening in radio then that is happening in radio now, and that is another great opportunity that I had in the 1970s, and that was producing the Howard Miller Show. Howard Miller was the first real conservative, right-wing, whatever you want to call him, bombastic, outrageous, Donald Trump-like television personality in Chicago, television and radio personality in Chicago. He was number one in the morning for over 21 years on WIND. In the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King, he said something on the air that was viewed as insensitive towards blacks and too pro-police, and he was suspended temporarily, and then his ego just would not allow him to understand that he actually had a boss. Even someone as good as he was, as powerful as he was, had a boss, and he just went ballistic and just said, I don't want to go back to WIND. It was the most expensive decision ever made in the history of Chicago broadcasting, the guy that let Howard Miller go. Because Howard Miller was off the air. He was immensely popular because of what he had said to a large portion of Chicago. And he eventually went back on WGN radio, and he was in the evening drive time. So they had Wally Phillips, the king of morning drive, and then Howard Miller became the king of evening drive after being a morning drive time guy. And after I ran and lost for when I ran for office.
Yes.
I went back to that show, and I was the producer of that show, and that was one of the most enjoyable, fun part of my life. I was the producer, but Howard Miller was an immensely talented guy, and he was very, very conservative.
Well, that's a lot of pressure on us over at WIND today, isn't it? To I mean, but is it even possible with the fractured media landscape that exists today? Is it possible to have another Howard Miller, another Rush Limbaugh in present tense? Is that ever going to happen again?
I don't think anybody's going to have that sort of run for 21 years, just because of the changes in the stations. They come and they go, and so that's. I don't think that's going to happen again. But again, it was, I mean, he was doing Rush. He was Rush Limbaugh before
Sure.
Rush Limbaugh. I mean, 25, 30 years before Rush Limbaugh.
What did Truman say? There's nothing new in this world, just the history we don't know. So
That's right.
There you go.
That's great.
Going back to what you said about Howard Miller, though, on radio and TV, and I think of Eric Severide as well at the network level. Well, why are you surprised at all that we don't see more commentary at the network affiliate level? You don't have, for example, a Fox Chicago station that gets hashtags compared to ABC and NBC and CBS.
Right.
Say, well, I know Chicago isn't exactly a bastion of conservatism, but there is a market out there, and since we can't beat ABC at its game, why don't we try and occupy a different kind of space, similar to what Fox News did at the national level? Why don't we see that at the network affiliate level in big cities where you have diverse populations?
I think part of the answer is just sort of it's a New York, Washington arrogance that only wants to promote, because again, Eric Severide was left of center.
Yeah.
When John Chancellor was on NBC, he was left of center. And so and that's when the world got its news from three sources. So three guys could wake up, have breakfast that day, read the same New York Times, and their newscasts would be almost identical. And that was a time when all of the political, commentary or analysis / commentary was all left of center. I think one of the reasons why, frankly, ABC was able to eventually gain some degree of respect and some degree of viewership was that they made a choice a long time ago, probably 35 years ago now. They put George Will on the air.
Well, and even Buckley and Gore Vidal for the '68 convention.
That is right.
Gave rise to the modern crossfire.
They understood that there was another way of doing it. I know at that particular time, when ABC was still a distant third, not that I had any great platform to say it. I said the best thing I would do if anybody ever said to you could be the president of ABC News. This was long before Roone Arledge. I said I'd move the headquarters to Chicago.
Well,
because literally half a block from where we are was Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey was the most listened to man in the history of radio. He defined ABC radio. He was a half a block from here. So
I got to caddy for Paul Harvey growing up.
Oh, really?
He was a member of Chicago Golf Club.
I bet you gave you a big tip.
I don't recall that.
Maybe not.
I don't recall that as much as I recall orange double knits and lime green shirts.
Yeah.
In kind of an inimitable fashion sense, in addition to radio voice and perspective.
Right.
But throughout this recent history of the last 4 decades that we're talking about the time you had this idea for the Museum of Broadcast Communications, which has now come to fruition. I mean, you were 3 years in to Beyond the Beltway?
Yes, because Beyond the Beltway went on the air in 1980.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. And I was working at Channel 2 when Beyond the Beltway started, and then I moved to WTTW in 1983.
So 35 years of Beyond the Beltway, from coast to coast, right?
Right.
How has that show, in your perspective about media and engaging a public that is interested in public affairs content, how has that changed over 35 years? Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's still the same mission, and the mission field has changed.
I think it's still the same mission, and it goes back to, first of all, the original name of the show when it went on the air on June 26th of 1980 was Inside Politics. It was meant to be, people, if you were casually interested in politics, I didn't care whether you were listening. I didn't want to have to stop and parenthetically explain everything to people. These were 4 people getting together, 2 right of center, 2 of left center, and they were saying outrageous things. They would forget that they were on the air sometimes.
Yeah, right.
Some were insiders, some were outsiders, some of the same, the litany that I give at the beginning of the program. Professors, politicians, pundits, all the above. So that was what the program originally was, and it was about inside politics. And after a while, once this was about 8 months into the show, when it got about a 40-page cover story in the Reader, it became a cult show. People were dying to get on the show, including Rahm Emanuel, who was a schlepper and a fundraiser for the dailies at the time.
He's still kind of is.
He's still around. He still raises an occasional dollar.
He's still
or
a
two.
schlepper of sorts.
So the show became very popular, but then I guess the most significant thing that happened, there were several things happening. First of all, at the national level, the Republicans were obviously gaining control of Congress, which happened in 94. But prior to that, in 1992, I met and fell in love with Kathy Osterman, who was the director of special events for the city of Chicago. She was the Democratic Ward Committeeman of the 48th Ward. We met, and she was Madam Inside, and I was a political commentator and host of, I was on WTTW, I was doing this program, and so to do a show called Inside Politics was sometimes difficult, because sometimes I knew things that if I had revealed them,
right,
she might have lost her job. I mean, it was more of a pressure on her, frankly, because anything
keep
that
information
happened,
away from you.
Anything happened was, what you glean in living together and being married.
And that was after you ran for state senate.
Oh, I ran for the state senate in 1970.
Yeah.
70. So this is now 92.
So she forgave you your sin of running for the state senate as a Republican in the city.
Because she was really bipartisan. In fact, when I ran against and lost in 1970 to the Democratic Ward Committeeman of the 48th Ward. I mean, I married the Democratic Committeewoman of the 48th Ward.
So, vengeance was yours.
That's right. And so that campaign is a whole different story. But so basically, so it became difficult. The inside politics stuff became kind of difficult in having a candid conversation. Every Thursday night. We were on Thursday nights at the time, and
it was Chicago focused.
All Chicago. And I had turned down some ideas that they wanted me to try the show nationally. I decided that I wasn't going to try the show nationally, and then eventually it went national on WBEZ. And then Kathy passed away, and the decision to go from WBEZ to WLS, although it was an easy call for me because I grew up listening to WLS, it happened at a time when she was literally failing very badly health-wise. And it also came at the time when the museum was moving from its original location, moving into the Chicago Cultural Center, and all of those things happened, in late 1991, and then in 1992, we were married on May 1st of 1992, and she died on December 8th of 1992.
Well, speaking of Chicago politics and kind of you being steeped in it, going back the better part of the last 45 years, as you've just described, is what happened in the Harold Washington, Bernie Epton race, does that still inform Chicago politics with respect to people who are of this mindset that Rahm Emanuel, I got some problems with him, and I'm talking about the C-suite corporate financiers that financed Richie Daley for 20 years and now are financing Rahm Emanuel the last 5.
Right.
He is not great. He isn't doing the things he said he would do in terms of tough decisions, being the adult in the room, but it could always be worse. When people say it could always be worse, we think about, well, in this last election, Rahm is better than Chewy Garcia or Willie Wilson. But when they say it could always be worse, are they still hearkening back to Harold Washington and that interregnum in the mid '80s?
I think some are. I think what they are fearful of is what happened there is democracy came to the city. They debated, they counted 29, 21. There was discussion. There was vibrant discussion, and both sides would not give an inch to the other side, and both sides vilified the other side because they needed to create a villain, and so they created the villain. To some in the city, it was Harold Washington. To others, it was Eddie Verdoliak.
Beirut by the Lake.
That's right, and so all of that environment stirred up a time when, those that like the corporate boardroom types that you refer to, they like things nice and neat and tidy, and council wars in the administration of Harold Washington was not neat and tidy, but it was far more democratic than it appears to be now.
And do you think that part of that hangover from the Harold Washington era, going in both directions, explains why Chicago, 60 years after Brown v. Board, 50 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is still really a racially polarized society? We don't have de jure segregation, but we have de facto segregation.
I think that's true.
And so is there a way out? Is there a way out for Chicago? I mean, if everybody recognizes the city is bankrupt morally and financially and in every other measurable way, but there's kind of this throw up your hands, yes, I agree with all of the criticism that you lodge, and have a nice day. There's nothing you can do about it.
Well, I think part of it, though, Dan, is that in recent history, the last 35, 40 years, there are examples of people who arrive on the scene, who are able to speak candidly, at least perceived by the people to speak candidly. They excite a constituency. It could be Jane Byrne, it could be Harold Washington, and they upset the apple cart.
But we haven't seen that for 30 years.
Not for 30 years, you're correct.
And we haven't seen that really, I mean, in terms of kind of the, do we have any up-and-comers in the city council? Do we have any up-and-comers in the state legislature, particularly on the Chicago Democrat side? It seems like anybody who was maybe an up-and-comer was, or has been, or was co-opted by the system. That it was that you can't fight City Hall, and also the powers that be are very good at shuffling anybody who could be problematic off to some statewide office,
right,
or off to some nice sinecure or something else.
No, clearly that's the case, and I think again, this is something I said, probably 30 years ago, because I've been dealing with this, this sense of why so many people in Chicago who do not get a piece of the pie in Chicago, or are not, they live in a cesspool of whether it's public education or can't walk the streets of their neighborhood. Why do they keep voting for people that continue that process and that lifestyle? And they do it. And so it's frustrating. But I think the suggestion I would make now, and the suggestion I made 30 years ago, was it would be great if there was a real, true group of wealthy individuals, because you need money, and they were to decide, what, we're going to do some research and development, and we are going to find a candidate or a person who's going to be the spokesperson for the opposition or the Republican Party. It doesn't have to be party label anymore. Who's going to be the opposition to and speak for good government. And they should make an investment in that person, be a man or a woman. They make an investment in that person. They say, you know what, we're in it for the long haul. We may not make it in the first run. It may take 4 years. It may take 8 years. It may take 12 years. We're going to keep investing in a product so that when people think of opposition and new ways in which things can be done in the city of Chicago to break this combine that you and John Cass talk about all the time, it requires investment, but it can't be some guy or woman that runs once and then you never hear from them.
And it's a rolling basis. So you're talking about being engaged in the dialogue, infusing yourself into the conversation on a daily basis.
On a daily basis.
So it's a run up to running or doing something else.
When something goes on at City Hall that doesn't smell right, the media should be going to a person and they put a microphone in their face. What do you think? And that person should articulate a way in which to make things better. And at the moment, as you say, we've got 50 aldermen, and there's not one whose name pops out immediately as someone who's in for the long run, who isn't going to be co-opted, or whose daily operation as being an alderman in the city of Chicago is not going to be made miserable by not only the mayor, but also by a system that basically punishes anybody that steps up.
Or even if they're a straight arrow, they're not essentially of the same philosophy of big government that has bankrupted the city and the state.
Well, that's the other point.
Yeah, and so conservatives like me who live in the city say, well, New York had Giuliani and Bloomberg, whatever you think about their Republican bona fides. L.A. had Richard Riordan.
Right.
Chicago's a more culturally conservative big city than either New York or L.A.
Right.
So it should be possible to elect a center-right mayor in this city, at least by that comparison. Is that a legitimate viewpoint, or is that whistling past the graveyard?
I think it's a legitimate viewpoint. And you're right. If it happened in New York and it happened in Los Angeles, why can it not happen in Chicago? Now the challenges are greater because I think the track record in New York of voting for Republicans, whether it was John Lindsay, who wasn't much of a Republican,
Yeah, right.
But I mean they have a record of voting for Republicans as well as in Los Angeles. It isn't the same political MO that they have in Chicago, but I think some of the dynamics are there, and I think we're in a situation now. It has to be someone also that frankly is media savvy and really and is in it for the long haul, is ready to say, you know what, I'm going to be this spokesman for 4 years, 8 years, or 12 years, and eventually I'm going to wear people down, or I'm going to convince enough people to throw the rascals out, and that's what it's going to take.
Well, through Beyond the Beltway and just kind of in the regular course of business operating the Museum of Broadcast Communications, you talk to people on both sides of the aisle, vast divergence of opinion on all matters, including Rahm Emanuel. And so 5 years in now, what's your sense of where people are at, including those well-heeled sorts that help drive the outcomes in elections, because as you said, you need money. Where do you think they are in Rahm Emanuel? Is this buyer's remorse, or is this rationalizing the mediocre?
I think it's coming to the realization that there isn't anyone out there at this moment that they've identified who they think can do the job better, or be more relied upon to do the work that they want to be done.
And you think, and Rahm just recently said, no, he's running for re-election in 2019. So the idea that if Hillary wins, he's going to be whisked back off to D.C., he says, no, he's here. What do you think?
I don't think there's a path for Rahm Emanuel to be president of the United States.
Do you think Rahm Emanuel thinks that?
I think so. I think he's a smart guy. I don't think there's a path for him to be elected president of the United States.
And do you think he is the type, as so many in Chicago and Illinois, that if you can't move up in weight class, then you're just going to be the person for life in your current weight class?
That could be. That's not such a bad idea, although the idea of the glory days of running the city where you're spending like a drunken sailor, those days are over, so maybe it would become a little less exciting to him. But I don't think politically, I don't think he has a political life on the national stage. And I also think just put it in context with someone from Chicago or Illinois. I mean, I don't believe that America is going to elect Barack Obama for 2 terms, and then maybe Hillary Clinton, maybe whether she wins or not. There's an Illinois-Chicago connection to her, and who's the next one in line? It's the former mayor or the current mayor of Chicago. I'm talking about 4 or 8 years from now. I just don't think that the rest of the other 49 states are going to say, we have to get our leaders from the Democratic Party only from one state. I don't think it's going to happen.
Speaking of national embarrassments, Mike Madigan is the longest running House Speaker
ever
at the state level in the history of our country.
Yes.
Staggering.
It is staggering.
He has been House Speaker in the Illinois House for 10% of this country's existence.
Right. And by the way, I want to put a little plug in there on that.
Yes.
Almost 30 years ago, Chicago Magazine asked me to do a cover story, an interview when they were doing Q&As with Michael Madigan, and he agreed to do it. He refers to me as his biographer. I did two. I did one with him, and I did one with Bill Daley.
Shortest Q&A in Chicago Magazine history? No.
3 hours.
Oh.
Dinner, Como Inn, just the two of us
Como Inn.
in the alcove, tape rolling, and that tape is on BeyondTheBeltway.com under the Bruce Dumont audio archives. And more people will hear what Michael Madigan sounds like, his voice. And he'll talk about this is about his early career. Now, forget about what's happened in the last 30 years. This is what makes the man tick.
So this gives you the insight into who Mike Madigan really is that you haven't gotten in the last 30 years because he doesn't talk anymore.
He does not talk anymore. But again...
So he used all his words with you, and then he ran out of words for 30 years. Yeah. And he probably stuck you with the bill at Como Inn.
No.
No.
Chicago Magazine paid.
No, of course.
But the point is...
And then Como Inn closed shortly later.
It
couldn't handle that kind of notoriety.
He talks about his life, his inspiration, his father, his relationship with his father. What happens to people who go to Springfield and fall in love with Jim Beam, not in serving the public people.
Yeah.
He talks about the personal discipline that he's had. He talks about his relationship with his father. He talks about the relationship with Jane Byrne. He talks about the early days when he and Richie Daley were good friends. He talks about the falling out. He talks about an awful lot of stuff, and I discovered that tape about 2 months ago.
Well, I want to check that out, and I'm sure our viewers do as well. But while Mike Madigan is personally very disciplined, when it comes to other people's money, a little bit less so. And so when he goes away, the undisputed most powerful politician in Chicago and has been, in the state, for some time, been for some time.
I agree.
Governors come and go, Mike Madigan stays. So when he goes away by act of Congress, act of God, however it comes to pass.
Act of God, probably.
Yeah, right. What happens? How does that void get filled?
Oh, boy. It'll be a huge battle. I think that you probably are going to see an emergence of a minority candidate that will take on a much stronger role in state government. And a lot is also going to depend is what is happening concurrent at that time, what happens on the state Senate side, because John Cullerton has been around a long time as well. And I think there will be a realization that somewhere in the leadership of the General Assembly, there should probably be someone who looks a little bit differently than the leadership of the last 35, 40 years.
And before we wrap up our chat today, Bruce Rauner, I know it's early, it's only 10 months, less than a year into his first term. If he raises structural taxes, even temporarily, does the temporary income tax hike that governors want to do, Republicans and Democrats in this state, or imposes a new structural tax, for example, on pension income, because that's something he hasn't closed the door on. He wouldn't close the door on it as a candidate, and he still hasn't closed the door as governor.
Right.
And when a politician doesn't close the door on a tax increase, they're thinking about it, if it's not a fait accompli.
On their mind.
Right. If Bruce Rauner does that, is he a one-term governor? Is he a one-term governor regardless?
I think he's a one-term governor if he says what you just said. I don't think he's a one-term governor if he stands fast on what he's doing right now.
So you think Rauner, despite all of the histrionics and the usual accusations from Chicago Democrats and from their constituent groups about starving children and starving seniors and the lack of sensitivity of the Republicans who don't want to continue to pass on unconstitutionally unbalanced budgets in perpetuity, Rauner is playing this right as we sit here in November of his first full year?
I don't think that he has another option at this moment. I mean, he was so firm in his campaign. He's been so firm thus far. I think that if he blinks, he will be a one-term governor. But I'm not so sure he's going to blink.
And Mark Kirk, one more prediction from you. Mark Kirk versus Tammy Duckworth.
I don't think Mark Kirk will be reelected.
And do you think you'll see a Republican candidate emerge, not necessarily against Mark Kirk because of where the party's at this point, but a new generation of Republican candidates emerge out of this still kind of muddled landscape in the Republican Party to challenge Dick Durbin in 6 years that we haven't seen,
I would-
to challenge more incumbents in a way that we haven't seen, despite having a governor that has resources to impose
No,
discipline?
I absolutely hope that that day comes, because you know, after one term in the Senate, Dick Durbin became an unbeatable guy. I don't think we live, and as I look at least what's happening this year in the body politic, I don't think that long-term political careers at high visibility offices are going to be a thing of the future. I think more and more people are going to be demanding a greater turnover, and at least I think that would be good. It would be good if we had a true two-party system in Illinois.
He is Bruce Dumont, Museum of Broadcast Communications, the 35-year run and counting beyond the Beltway. Bruce, thanks so much for joining us on this edition of Against the Current. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan.